Hi, everybody. It's Plastic EP coming in from Melbourne, Australia. That's right, Australia. Now, I've got a freelance journalist, right, Jonathan Knott, and I've got to tell you what's happened. Vicky found an article on the net about the Beatles trying to buy an island in 1967, and it's true, right? And I knew about it for years and years, but after reading Jonathan's article, it's the most in-depth article I've read about this topic. How are you today, Jonathan?
I'm good, thanks. How
Great.
are you?
Tell everybody now just how it came about that you wrote the article and you're freelance. So just explain how you got the story out with that in-depth story.
Sure. So it starts quite a long time ago. I'm a freelance journalist. I've written about travel, certainly in the past. And I was in Greece, researching a travel guide, and I heard about this story, and I thought it sounded interesting. So I thought maybe that would be an interesting article. Then when I looked into the subject, there was sort of lots of slightly mysterious aspects about the story. So they definitely went to Greece, and it seems like they definitely wanted to buy an island, but there were sort of names that didn't seem to exist. The description of the island was sort of didn't seem to match any island that I was aware of. So having looked into it for quite a long time, I've sort of, that was back in 2010 that I first heard of it. So I've then been sort of focusing on that for the past couple of years and writing my own newsletter about it. And then recently I wrote this article in Greek Reporter, sort of summarizing what I found out about the whole period, basically.
So the Greek Reporter, that's where you published it?
So I have my own Substack called Follow the Sun, which is where I've been publishing sort of what I've discovered about the topic. And then, last month I wrote an article for this website, Greek Reporter, which was a sort of summary of what I found out. Yeah.
So I'm just saying, this interview now, we're the first people getting it out on video to the world. That's correct?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it hasn't been on video yet.
Okay, now let's get into it. I know a few things about it. So I don't want to cloud the story, and my parents are Greek, and I've been to Greece 4 times. So I'm familiar with the islands. So now I want you to give the background about it and tell everybody the story, basically what you know. Let's get it all out there to them, and then I'll ask you a few questions.
Sure. So I first heard the story when I was on Skiathos, which is a Greek island, and there was a story there that people say sometimes that the Beatles wanted to buy this island called Subria, which is a little island next to Skiathos. And so I thought, well, that sounds interesting. And then when I looked into the story, there were, in various books about the Beatles, it's mentioned, and people say they wanted to buy an island. They had a Greek friend called Alexis Mardas who sort of offered to help them do that. And then because of the rules at the time, they had to get permission from the British government for the purchase. So they got that permission. They had to buy this special currency, which they started to do. And this was all in summer 1967. And then a few months later, the sale fell through. So it didn't actually happen, but there was, they seriously started the process of buying an island. And there's documents in the National Archives in London, sort of with a record of that. But yeah, it fell through. But then the identity of the island is still a little bit mysterious.
I've got to say, they made money on the currency. People don't know that they made money on the exchange rate of currency. They did. They went away with a profit.
They did.
Without buying an island.
Yeah, so they had to buy this special currency called property dollars. And then they bought some of that, and then they sold it back. And because of the premium on the exchange rate, they made a bit of money on that, which is an interesting little detail. Yeah. So, yeah.
They lost money in merchandise in 1964, but they came back and they made a bit of money on a sale of an island that fell through. So this is where it gets really fascinating. Now, I'm just saying, the island you're talking about near Skathos, right? It's a little small island. Has it got an actual name? And have you identified that as the actual first island they wanted to buy? Because there could have been 2 or 3 that they thought about.
Yeah, so there are sort of some descriptions of this island in books and also in the documents, and it's the consensus is that there was one main island about 80 acres big, and then several smaller islands nearby it. And there's also sort of the descriptions mention olive trees, things like that. So I was looking, for an island that matched that description. It's pretty hard to find. But then, actually, a few years ago, it occurred to me that there's this group of islands called the Licardonicia, which are at the top of this bigger island called Evia, and they actually match the descriptions pretty closely. So I wouldn't say it's 100% certain, but in my opinion, I think those are likely to be the ones that they, the ones that they actually seriously tried to buy, and they do match the descriptions pretty closely. But I think it's a bit more complicated than that, because there may have been other islands that they were interested in, and one of those could have been Superia, this little island next to Skiathos, and another one could have been this island called Triada, which means Holy Trinity, and that's sort of around the same area. And that's if you Google this topic, you'll often find island articles which say that it was Triada that they wanted. So yeah, that's sort of the established narrative. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense, because my estimation or my analogy of this subject was been going on and on for years. You go on the internet, you see them in Greece, there's photos. And then that they wanted to buy an island. But the problem with Greece is there's so many islands there that you might start off, let's go for a boat trip and look at this island. But while we're going to this island, we're going to see 3, 4 as well that could be for sale. And then by the time you finish, the one that they identified that they may have been first interested in without seeing it ends up being something totally different. That's why I think the whole subject is cloudy, because Greece is full of islands.
Exactly. Yeah, there's so many islands in Greece that, if you're just trying to find an island without, and you haven't narrowed it down to a particular area, it's almost impossible, because there's so many islands. But what helped me was, this was back in 2020. I looked at this book by Alistair Taylor, who was, he called himself their Mr. Fix-It, so he sort of worked with them quite closely. And he was sent to sort of scout out islands for them. And he talks about, on the trip in Greece, going up this narrow stretch of sea where there was a bridge between two pieces of land. And that sort of jogged my memory of this place in Evia, where there is that bridge that lifts up, what he talks about. Well, the bridge, it actually swings to one side. But I thought, well, that sounds a bit like this place in Evia. And then once I'd narrowed it down to that area that seemed likely, that's when it occurred to me that it could have been the Licardonicia group of islands.
Well, if you find one there that's nearly 80 acres, I mean, you're pretty close to that, because these islands have got different sizes. But I just want to ask you now, who's living that went to look for the islands? When the Beatles went, did the 4 of them go? Because that means then Paul and Ringo are 2 of the ones, and probably their girlfriends, that can tell us the truth.
Yeah. So they all arrived at different times, but there was, all the Beatles were there, and then Ringo's wife actually wasn't there, because she was in the late stages of pregnancy, and Ringo actually left before they started looking for islands, so he left a bit early. And then there was Patty Harrison, George's wife, Cynthia Lennon, and Julian Lennon, their son, and then Jane Asher was there, and I think also Patty's sister was there. And then there was Alexis Mardas, Alistair Taylor, and Neil Aspinall. I think that was it. Well, there was quite a big group of them.
Well, I'm just going to say, I'm going to send a few emails out and see what feedback I get. But as I said, this is a very fascinating subject for me, because at that time at 67, you're a pioneer to go to want to buy an island. And then you're asking yourself, right, what did they want an island for? Well, first of all, a vacation spot for all of them, if they all 4 wanted to go, or if they wanted to go individually, or if they wanted their friends to go for a apple there for holidays, they had somewhere to go. Now, whether there was something on this island or they planned to build on it, that's another question. So once we can identify the island, that's going to help a lot. Because if they
Uh-huh.
physically went there, and one of these members of the Beatles entourage can tell us and clarify, right, it was definitely that island there or that group of islands, then the problem's solved. So I'm going to try and see what I can do on that.
Yeah, that because I haven't actually spoken to anyone who was on that trip, but there are some people who are still around who were on that trip. So yeah, if they happen to have any memories, that would obviously be helpful. Yeah.
Now, other than that, I'm just saying, what else can you tell me that you've learned? Do you know the amount of money that they paid as either a deposit or the amount that they paid in currency?
Well, the total cost of the island was said to be 90,000, which I think in today's money that's about 2 million, as far as I know. But then in these documents it says that they needed additional costs to sort of, because there were some houses on the island that they wanted to redo and use as holiday homes basically, and that would cost a bit of money. So I think that the total amount they needed was about 120,000 at that time.
That'll be 120,000 pounds, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, well, 120,000 pounds to the Beatles, I don't think was a problem to buy an island that, who knows what it's worth today. The island, I mean. Get an island from the Greek government, for example, to be privately owned, or whether it was privately owned and they were buying from a private buyer, this is what we've got to establish. Are they buying from the Greek government or are they buying from a private owner?
Yeah, so there's lots of questions about who would have owned the land and how that all would have worked in practical terms. So I think that these islands, the Lichadonisia, from what I understand, I think that they were privately owned at the time, and still now actually. But I think from what I understand, there was several people who owned land on that island, and then what I've been told was that, well, certainly there's a story that someone inquired about the Beatles buying it, and then all the people who owned those parts of land on the island couldn't agree on the sale, and that's part of the reason why it fell through. So I don't know how much truth there is in that, but I was told that. But the thing that I found relatively recently was that, so I had this idea that it was this group of islands, and then last year I found these reports in a newspaper called Torvima, by a journalist, and that gives actually quite a detailed reports on the locations they went on their cruise, and it does talk about them going up that gulf between Evia and the mainland, and then to the Sporades Islands where Skiathos and some other islands are. So that was kind of what I was thinking, and that seems to, give some more strong evidence that that is where they went. So yeah.
And I just want to say, Paddy Harrison's sister Jenny Boyd, she went with them.
I think she did, yeah, as far as I know, yeah.
Okay, I'm going to try and follow that up. That I can follow up. So, in other words, now what I'm saying is we're talking about different times in '67, and I mean, as I said, the challenge of doing that and doing it when you think about, like, for example, I don't know the year George Harrison bought Fryer Park, but I'm saying, compare that to buying an island too. The price of the island now, I can tell you now, it's like, I think it's very hard to buy islands in Greece.
Yeah.
Because of the red tape.
I think it is, yeah. And it's interesting, it's sort of, it's still seen as a desirable thing for wealthy people to do, to own an island. But it's interesting when that started, and I think obviously Onassis, the Greek ship owner, he owned an island, Scorpios.
Yeah, that's right.
I don't know if you've been there.
Well, I mean, I've been there. The boat takes you there to the island, and you're allowed to swim on the water next to it. You can't actually physically go on it, but you can go there.
Okay. Yeah, interesting. And so I don't know if he sort of started a trend or whether it was already a trend before that. But the other interesting thing about islands in Greece, I think, maybe you can help me with this, but I thought that it's the law that any beach in Greece has to have public access. So even if it's private land, the beaches have to be public access. I don't know if that's true.
What you say may be a valid point. In 2023, that's something that's got to be checked out, because in 1967, who knows what the rules were? Because I'm saying, you've got the Greek tourism then. But now in 2023, that Greek tourism now, people coming from all over the world, Greece is the #1 destination for holidays. And I think Italy's #2, right? I read that recently on the net, like a day ago. And I've got relatives now in Greece having a great time and going to Italy as well. Because people, even from Australia, every year, it's becoming that people really want to go to Greece and enjoy their holidays on the islands and on the mainland. I mean, talking about islands, I'm just saying, Corfu, right? A lot of people don't know that you can fly from England, the UK where you are, to Corfu. Now, that's something have you done that flight?
I haven't done that flight. I normally fly to Athens if I go to Greece. But yeah, I did know they have direct flights to Corfu.
Yeah, well, what happens is myself personally, I want to fly in from the UK, see people there, right? Beatle people, fly to Corfu, because 2 hours under there on the mainland, I've discovered a place called Parga that I went to, right? Parga. And what happens is it's a seaside town with three main streets. You go there and it's so idyllic that at night it lights up with taverns, with whatever you want. The nightlife is great. But in the morning, I'm telling you, when you sit down and have a breakfast and you're looking at this rock in the middle of the water in the cafeteria there, and you're left alone, right? Because the tourists are either sleeping or whatever, you feel $1 million. Even if you haven't got $1 million, it's like you feel $1 million being there. I can't describe it. And going around Greece and seeing different islands, like I went to Paros and whatever, these islands are just unbelievable. I found a spot on Paros where there was a little tavern and a little bay of water. And I went there and it was like only 8 people there. And it was like, once I got in the water, it was like all the stress levels just went up in the air. It was like you're reborn. I'm not joking. That's how I felt. I can't describe the feeling, but that's what Greece does to you.
I personally, I think that Greece does have a very special atmosphere and quality. Just to do with the landscape. I think and the weather as well. But yeah, I think a lot of people feel that about Greece, that it has a very special atmosphere there. Yeah.
And this topic fascinates me, right? Because as I said, my parents are Greek background, and Vicky, my wife, is Greek background. What other things have you discovered with writing the article that you can tell us?
Well, just to mention one thing is that, do you know the documentary, The Beatles Anthology?
Yeah.
There's a little section of that about them wanting to buy an island, and actually there are some shots in that look very similar to these islands that they've had in this year. So that's one interesting aspect of that. But I suppose the other interesting thing is that before they went on this cruise, looking at islands, they stayed in Athens for a bit, and they did a sort of day trip one day to Delphi, which is this ancient sacred site.
Yep.
And then they visited this beach at Itaea, and they also went to this village called Arachova. So when you see photos of the Beatles in Greece, they're often from that day, and it's the press were kept informed of that trip, apparently, according to various accounts. So it's sort of interesting that one part of the trip, was quite heavily covered by the media, but then the later part we don't really know that much about.
I've got to say, your Greek is excellent.
Is it?
Yeah, no, it is, believe me.
Oh, you mean the way I pronounced it?
Yeah, the way you pronounce it, because I've got to tell a lot of people, I'm going to tell people this, so I don't have to, but I want to, okay? What happens is when I go to Greece, I went to Greek school here in Australia and whatever, and I mean, I tend to speak Greek spasmena. Now, spasmena means broken, like broken English. I like to go up to people and start talking in English and then break into Greek in the conversation. And then I like to start off in Greek and then go into Australian in English in the conversation. Like, in other words, you meet someone, you go, Pussy sekala, pussy nata prama. In other words, how are you? What's going? What's happening? And then I'll go, everything okay? And I'll go, do you understand my Greek? I'll say to them in English. They go, yeah, no worries. Like, there isn't a problem there.
Yeah, I don't speak Greek fluently. I've tried to learn a little bit, so I can, when I look at Greek newspapers or something, I can understand. I can work it out with the help of the dictionary, and I can speak a little bit. So you can probably speak it better than I can, to be honest.
Well, I went to Greek school, but as I said, when I go to Greece, they tend to speak faster, right? They're faster. I'm more slower. You know, like I can't talk a million miles an hour. With English I can, but not with Greek. It's like a different ballgame. But I want to ask you, do we know who instigated the idea to buy an island in Greece? Where did the idea come from? Did it come from one of their staff? Did it come from one of the Beatles? Or did it come from all of the Beatles saying, hey, listen, we've got to get out of England and we've got to go and buy an island and just try and do our own scene? Or did it come from George? Have we narrowed it down where this idea came from?
Well, I think the specific idea of Greece, I think, probably came from Alexis Mardas, who was their Greek friend that they met in London. But if you, Barry Miles, in his book about Paul McCartney many years from now, he talks about this, and he says they had this idea about going to live somewhere, and then apparently at one point they talked about Norfolk, and then apparently Alexis Mardas he was the one that encouraged them to look at an island in Greece, because he talked about having connections in Greece and he could help them sort out, the practicalities of it and stuff like that. So from what I know, or from what I can gather, it seems like he was quite an important influence on the whole plans.
Yeah, well, he was like their, he was like making things for the Beatles, whether that be recording studios or light boxes or whatever. He was like he's the genius that's going to bring the new technology to the Beatles at the time. And being Greek himself, why wouldn't he say, come buy an island? Because he knows what it's like there. I'm sure the Beatles had actually bought a Greek island. They would have loved the lifestyle. Now, whether they made that like their own community, or whatever they did, or made it just private for themselves, it's not a way out idea. People are buying islands all the time.
But the interesting thing is that John Lennon actually previously bought an island in Ireland, and he did actually buy that one. I think that was around '66. And then he bought that, and then sort of didn't really do anything with it. So Alistair Taylor talks about that in one of his books as well. But I think John Lennon was particularly keen on this idea of getting an island. So it's interesting to think, why does he have that? Why does he have that? Why does that particularly appeal to him? That idea of sort of living on an island.
I think it's all privacy and getting away from the fans, really. At that
point.
So
no, I think that was, this is just my own ideas, but I think obviously in '66 they'd done a lot of touring and they were sort of pretty exhausted of doing live touring, and they wanted a bit of time to themselves and to focus on making music in the studio. So I guess the idea of doing that on an island where they could have some peace and quiet would have appealed to them.
Amazing. Anything else you can tell us from your research?
Yeah, probably. In these newspaper reports, there's sort of daily reports in this newspaper called Tovima, and then there's another newspaper called Macedonia that also reported on what they did, not quite as often, but it talks about their trip to Delphi and Arachova, and then it also mentions this. According to the report, there was a time on Skiathos when the Beatles yacht, or the yacht they were using, was in the harbour of Skiathos, and then they started playing music on board the yacht, and then apparently all these people gathered in the harbour of this island and started sort of dancing around to the Beatles music. So I don't know if that's true, but it's quite an interesting little story.
I have seen photos on the net of the Beatles dancing.
Really?
Now, whether they're dancing to Greek music or I'm sure they would have been dancing to Greek music.
Yeah, so that was on their trip to Arachova, and there were these Greek musicians who sort of started playing, and then according to the reports, the Beatles sort of joined in with that, and then there were these pictures of them dancing in a circle. I think that's from that time. Yeah.
Amazing story. I just want to thank you so much, Jonathan, for being on the show. And this is a fascinating subject. Let's dwell into it and see if we can come up with more information. Because, as I said, I've got a few Beatle connections, so I think I might have to ask around and see what I can come up with. And when I do, I can get back to you and tell you what sort of feedback I got and what actual information I got, because I don't think it'll be hard to narrow it down to where it actually was from people that were actually there.
No, yeah. If you can speak to people who were there and what they remember about it, that'd be really useful. Yeah, yeah.
Well, I'm just saying, it's like unbelievable, and this topic just fascinates me. Thanks again, Jonathan.
Well, it's been a pleasure. It's been a pleasure.